Okay, after all of that, welcome again to another instalment of the our short course with Macquarie University. This evening or this afternoon, it's still nice and late outside. We're going to be talking about pragmatics. It's not going to be me, of course. It's going to be Dr. Jill Murray. Now, Jill, we were just chatting with her, and it's I think you should know out there. Look, and Jill, I do have to mention this. Jill has been involved in community languages before, so she knows quite a lot about the sector. I'll let her speak about that perhaps later on. But be rest assured, everybody, that she is one of us, as it were. Okay, so look, welcome, Jill. Welcome, everybody. We've got just over 110 people, so I think we can start. If I could just ask everybody just to remember one thing, and I'll say this every single week, just some housekeeping. Your microphones, if you don't need to speak, please don't keep them off. Your cameras, if you don't want to be recorded, please keep your cameras off. And I will be sending a link. You'll receive a number of links this evening. One of them from me will be for the attendance. The certificate, I will say once again that the certificates, it will be one certificate at the end of the whole course, and that'll happen after the last session. So it's not one certificate per session. Okay, so please, when you receive a link, if it doesn't work, don't worry, it does work out in the end. It's a Google form. You tick the session or sessions that you've attended. Simple as that. And that is for your certificate. All right, I'll pass it over to Jill. Thanks, everybody, and we will see you afterwards. Jill.
Thanks, everyone. Well, it's lovely to meet you. And as Alex mentioned, I've got a fairly long association with the community languages sector. I used to work at the University of New South Wales at the Institute of Languages, where we ran the Professional Development Certificate for community language teachers. So some of you may have experienced that. And I was involved in that for about 11 years, in both running it and teaching it. But as well as that, I used to be a language teacher myself, and I also used to be a teacher educator, and I've been a lecturer and researcher at Macquarie now for about 12 years. So it's a great pleasure to be here tonight and to be talking about pragmatics, which is a subject very close to my heart. Before we start, I've been asked by Alice just to go through some of the basic housekeeping for you. So I'm going to share my screen, and you should be able to see my PowerPoint in a minute. Can everybody see that? Nod if you can. Right, okay.
All good.
All good. Okay. So first of all, a few little things about the management and how we're going to organize this, because I know that some of you haven't been to some of the earlier sessions. There might be some people here who are here for the first time. If you're one of those people, if you're not, this may already be familiar to you, but if you are one of those people, don't use virtual backgrounds, because sometimes we have some difficulties with bandwidth. And we're going to be using the video and audio, the chat. We're going to be using breakout rooms. So while I'm talking, please keep your audio mute and your video switched off during the full class sessions, unless you want to speak to the class. We'll be using Padlets, and we'll be recording video and audio, and we'll be sharing these with participants who couldn't come to the live session. We're also recording the chat, but we won't be sharing those. And we're not recording what happens in the breakout rooms. So there'll be a couple of sessions in breakout rooms where you'll be put with other students or other teachers to talk, and I'll be coming around those rooms just to say hello and see how you're going. You'll automatically be assigned to a room with a small group of students, and before you go to the room, you need to use the link in the chat to open up the relevant Padlet links. So you might like to just play around and make sure that you can all access the chat. When you arrive in the room, you unmute your audio, switch on your video, and introduce yourself to the other participants. And it will, everything you type in the Padlet will be saved, and we'll be not actually giving the Padlet out to people, but we will be using some of your responses in what we give to you afterwards as part of the teaching resources. So let's make a start. The idea of pragmatics might be quite unfamiliar to some people, or some people may only have a vague idea what exactly is meant by it. So I'm going to start off just by outlining what pragmatics means and why it is important. Also, what the link is between pragmatics and culture, why teachers neglect it, and it's for a number of reasons, which are often quite good reasons, but I want to show you that it's something that you don't have to necessarily push aside other important things in order to do, that you can be doing pragmatics while you're doing other important things. And finally, how can it be included in a teaching program, which is already, as we know, very full? So pragmatics is all about using language in a social context. And these are the 4 things that are most important with pragmatics. It's about making language choices that are right for the context. So in English, you wouldn't speak the same way to everybody all the time, would you? It depends on who you're talking to. It depends on what you want. It depends on what you want to achieve, how you're feeling, all of this. And this is an area that we often don't necessarily think about automatically when we're teaching language, how to match the language and the context that we intend our students to use it in. Also, it's about communicating in ways that express your intended meanings. And we don't always say exactly what we mean. Sometimes we imply things. And sometimes it's not always easy to understand quite what the intended meanings of other people are, even if we know the words and if we know the grammar. And finally, it's using language in ways that are consistent with the culture and the values of the language community. So our culture is very important for our language, for the language that we use and what's considered to be appropriate in different situations. It's often said that, that vocabulary is very important, because without vocabulary, you can't say anything. And grammar is very important, because without grammar, you can't make your meaning clear. But pragmatics is important in a different way. It's important because your use of pragmatics tells people who you are, what sort of person you are. Are you a polite person? Are you a kind person? Are you a respectful person? Or are you rude and pushy? And sometimes our pragmatic competence lags a little bit behind these other competencies in language. And we don't always manage to convey these meanings that present ourselves in the way that we really are. Okay, so whenever people communicate, there's always various aspects to the context. So for example, who is talking? Who are the people? And what are the relationships of the people? There might be differences in status, there might be differences in power, maybe there are differences in how well you know the people, and all of these things affect the kind of language that you use to talk to them. Also, where the conversation is taking place. Is it in a cafe where you have to shout because it's noisy? Is it in a school where there are a lot of people who have to take turns to talk? Is it a conversation between friends? All of these things affect the kind of language that you would use in a conversation. There's also how. Is it distance? Is it face-to-face? These days unfortunately, we have fewer face-to-face conversations than we used to. But the way that we communicate with people is different when we can see their faces. It's different on the telephone. It's different when we don't actually have access to their gestures and their facial expressions. So all of these things are part of the context. And this is all the area that pragmatics covers. The fourth reason, the fourth thing we have to think about with context is why the people are communicating. What are they trying to say? And what's the actual purpose of what they're saying? And the way that we communicate, what we say and don't say, has got a lot to do with what we think people already know. That is what we can consider to be mutually assumed knowledge. So why is this important for community language students? Well, it's important because they need to communicate successfully in the language in a lot of different situations. They need to communicate in Australia when they're talking maybe in their family, with their parents, or with older members of the family. They need to communicate on visits home to their parents' or grandparents' countries. And they need to communicate more and more via technology, that is using Skype or Zoom to talk to people in their home countries. Now, all of these things, even if they only do them a little bit, give them a sense of belonging to the culture. And when you can do these things successfully, you get the identity as being part of that culture. I know that one of the main problems that community language teachers face is keeping students motivated. And I think one of the reasons that they don't always feel motivated is that they don't always feel that they belong to the culture that the language represents. If they do belong, they're much more likely to feel motivated, and it's much more likely that it's going to be more possible for us to keep maintaining the language in the way that we'd like to do it. Now, I'd like to give you just a few examples from my own research, first of all. And this research is on people who grew up in Australia and learnt the language there. English was their main language. And they went home to their parents' countries, sometimes to live, and they had some problems with pronunciation, they had some problems with grammar, but the problems that they had with pragmatics are the things that really affected how connected they felt with their country or their parents' country. And I just want to show you a couple of examples of these because they're all really about pragmatics. They're just some simple ones. Now, English-speaking people say please and thank you a lot, and you might have noticed that. But in other countries, it's not. There are other ways of being polite. So here's an example from a Greek person who grew up in Australia. She was born in Greece, and she went back to Greece, and she had this experience. So she said, there was an instance when I first went to Greece that we went to a kiosk to purchase something, and we said, oh, can I please have something? And we said, thank you. And the guy said, why are you pleasing and thanking me? You want something? I gave it to you. What's the big deal? Now, this may not seem like a big deal, and yet it is, in that they felt apart. They felt not so much part of their home culture because they were thanking in the English way, the way that they'd learned in Australia. Here's another one with please. So this is a boy called Dimitris who went back to Greece, and he said probably one of the most obvious differences that I've noticed in day-to-day speaking is we, and he meant we in Australia, will use please a lot more. Where if I go to a restaurant or to a cafe and order something to eat, I say, please, can I please have this? Whereas if I go to do the same thing in Greece, if I'm ordering a coffee, I'll just say one frappe and tell them how many sugars I want. So in Greece, it wasn't expected that they would say please in the same way and as often, because there are different ways of being polite in that society. Here's another example, and we'll talk about this later on in the session. It's about using polite forms of address. Now, many languages have more than one you. And later on in the session, we're going to get a chance to talk a little bit about the politeness systems of the language that we teach. So some languages have a singular and a plural form of you, which is the polite form. And other languages do it more differently and in different ways. Now in English, we only have one you. So these people who went back to Greece were not always aware of how to use the singular and the plural you correctly. They might know, for example, the singular is less formal and the plural is more formal, but they didn't actually know how and when to use it. So this is the story of one of the people I spoke to. And she said, I was tragic. I was tragic with that. I was actually told off by a few people in Athens when I first came. You should be talking to me in the plural. That's how I learned to speak in Australia to my parents and my relatives. Our parents never used to speak in plural with each other. I mean, my family were from a rural background. They didn't really use the plural. They didn't know about these things. So when she went back to her country, she found that what she learnt in Australia, the Greek that she learnt in Australia, wasn't really appropriate. It wasn't quite enough to get by in Athens. And she was working as an English teacher in Athens and finding that she had difficulty with her students. Now, there's another thing, which is a different area of pragmatics, that all of these things are about context. That's the thing that unites them. Sometimes the questions that we talk about or the questions that we ask may be appropriate in one culture and not so much in another. Here's an example of another one of my Greek respondents who was talking about a question that was asked to her. So she said, actually the other day, I've put on a lot of weight and I've started walking, and I saw a friend's mother-in-law and she said, I sort of greeted her and she said, is that you? I haven't recognized you. You've put so much weight on. And I thought, yeah, well, that's why I'm exercising, you know. She was so direct. Sometimes it's too blunt for me. Even I get shocked after all these years. So all of these experiences they were upsetting for these people, and they reduced their ability to feel that they fitted in when they went back to their parents' country. Now, all of these people went to Greek school, and some of them even went to university, and they still didn't learn about how to use these things. So this is what I hope I'm going to be able to make a difference about, and maybe to make the way that you think about context a little bit different, and maybe make you possibly just tweak some of the things that you do in your teaching so that it's possible for you to stop your students having experiences like these. So pragmatics is all about culture. It relates very much to culture. Now, when we talk about culture, sometimes we think about it as the surface manifestations of culture. And these are all useful, valuable, interesting things. So they're things like the art, the dance, the foods, the costumes, the music, and this little diagram that you can see here. All of those things are above the surface, right? They're things that we can see. But below that, there's what we call a deep culture. And that contains things like communication styles and rules. So the rules about facial expression, about gestures, eye contact, personal space, all of these things are related to how you make meanings in a context. Also, there are other deep things like notions of what is courtesy, what is friendship, what is leadership. Now, I can imagine some of you are thinking, yeah, but we teach kindergarten. How can we possibly do anything about this? And I want to try to convince you that you can at least make a start in making sure that your students start to notice how things are done a little bit differently when they speak to people in the languages that you're teaching. So even simple things like how we do speech acts are related to deep culture. So our attitudes to maybe how we must respect older people, or how we respect people in a workplace or something like that. Let's just look at a really, really simple example, which I'm sure you're going to find very, very easy. This is an example of making a request in English. Now, I'd like you to do this as an activity in English in the chat room. I'd like you to pick one of these, your sister, your aunt, your university lecturer, or a stranger on a bus. And I'd just like you to write, how would you ask each of these people, or one of these people, if you could borrow a book from them? All right? Can everybody who feels like it just do that in English, and then we'll have a little look together at what you've done. Okay, so somebody has put, pass me the book, please. Could I have the book? I'd like to know, who are these? Oh, don't write to me privately, please. Write to everybody so we can all see it. Yeah. I'd like to know who you're talking to. Are you talking to your sister? Are you talking to a stranger on a bus? So we've got, could I borrow your book, please? Hello, could you lend me your book? Good. One for the sister. Give me this book. Pass me the book, please. Sis, give me the book. Okay, so we're using quite informal language here with the sister. Sis, could I have the book? The book, right? So there's not even a request there, just the book. Here's somebody writing about a stranger on a bus. Sorry, may I borrow your book, please? Somebody to the lecturer. Would it be possible to borrow your book? And may I have this book, please, for the stranger? Here's a nice one. I couldn't help noticing the book you're reading. May I please have a look at the title? And she's written here, I wouldn't ask to borrow it. Now that is an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've given you this task to do, but I didn't actually give you the option of saying, no, I wouldn't do that, right? But some of you may feel a little bit uncomfortable if you're on a bus asking to borrow somebody's book. I would. I mean, the only situation I'd probably really do it is if it was a very long bus trip and I was very bored and I had nothing to read and I could see that they've just finished the book, and then I might do it as a kind of a hint. So what we've got in the chat line there, and thanks for all those great contributions, what we've got in the chat line are a whole lot of different levels of politeness for how you would do this. Lecturer, may I please borrow your book? Sister, can I have the book for a couple of days? Nobody's asked the aunt. What's the matter? Don't your aunts have any books? Anyway, that's fine. We'll go back now to the PowerPoint. Okay. And the examples that we've shown, okay, are very much related to how well you know the person. So the contact that you have with the person, like have you met the person before? Do you know them well? Also the power distance between you and the person. In English, we have much more polite forms for your university lecturer. And for the stranger on the bus, because it's a very, very strange thing to ask. I mean, it's quite normal to ask your sister, your aunt, or your lecturer to borrow a book. Nothing wrong with that. But a stranger on a bus is quite a weird thing to do, isn't it? So for a stranger on the bus, you would probably have to use much more complex language if you decided to do it at all. Now, if it was something like borrowing a car, okay, you may ask your sister, you may ask your aunt perhaps, but you simply wouldn't ask your university lecturer. I'm happy to say that in all the years I've been teaching in a university, no student has ever asked to borrow my car. I'm pleased about that because I'd probably have to say no. As for the stranger on the bus, you definitely wouldn't be doing that. So we're looking here at two kinds of knowledge about pragmatics. One is what we call pragmalinguistic knowledge, and that involves knowing the right words and grammar to use to perform a speech act in a real life situation. So, for example, should I say please or thank you when I ask for this? Or in the case of borrowing something, should I say may I, could I possibly, would it be all right if I, okay, how should I do this? The other kind of knowledge, and this is just as important, but again, not so commonly taught, is what to do and what not to do. And so, for example, is it okay to ask for this at all? Is it okay to tell somebody that they've put on weight? Is it okay to tell somebody that they've lost weight? Is it okay to ask somebody why they're not married? Is it okay to ask them or expect them to tell you how much they earn? So these are socio-pragmatic things, and they're related to the culture in which the conversation is happening. Okay, so politeness and directness in English, as we see, what happens here is that it goes from a very direct statement, give me the book, this is imperative, like an order, and some people said they would do that with their sister, to a very, very polite, very long, very complicated, I was wondering if I could possibly blah, blah, blah. And sometimes there's even an indirect hint where you don't actually say what you're thinking. You don't really make a request at all. You just make a statement of some other kind and ask whether, or hope that the person will notice what it is that you mean and infer your meaning. So it's not always the same in all languages. Many languages have a different idea of what politeness means and how they achieve it. So in English, it's all about the power and status, the familiarity of the person, and how big an imposition it is. But in other languages, it can be done differently, both pragmalinguistically and sociopragmatically. So we're going to go to the first task now, which you'll find in the Padlet, and I think that's going to be put up in the chat for you. So the task is as follows, that in English, the more indirect you are, the more polite. Now, other languages do politeness in other ways. So what do you think? Do you think people say what they mean more directly in your language than they do in English? Or are they more indirect? Now you can get a bit of a clue to this when you think about the stereotypes that attach sometimes to people who speak your community language. So for example, is there a cliche that people who speak your language talk a lot, or that they interrupt a lot, or that they're very direct, or that they're very indirect, that they never say what they mean? So what I want you to do is think, not just, yes, they're more direct or they're less direct, but tell the other people in your group what it is about your language that makes people think that. And this isn't an easy task. You're going to have to think about this a bit. Also, apart from indirectness, what other language resources do you draw on to be more polite? So some languages have got completely different vocabulary choices. Like when I'm speaking English, I use the word house to refer to a house, no matter who I'm talking to. But if I was speaking Japanese, there might be two different words, like there's uchi, a more familiar one, and otako for a more formal situation. In some languages in Indonesia, there are 6 or 7 levels, and I think Thai has many different levels of vocabulary. Are there different ways of addressing people? Is there anything else, right, which maybe is a way that you can be polite in your language? So let's get into groups now. I'll just stop the sharing. Okay, so you can all see the Padlet. I think that maybe there were some people who weren't able to access the Padlet, but we'll be sending out some of the information which is put here. And these are great. What they show is that you're able to think about the differences between English and your own language.
Not yet. No.
Yeah. Could everyone who's not talking please turn their mic off? Because sometimes, thank you, we get background noise. Usually it's my dog barking, and I banished him to downstairs so you can't hear him. Okay, so we can see politeness in Poland. Here's one. So if you always speak to a superior or stranger, you have to use the polite form. And one in Malaysia. Here's one in Laos. We use the personal pronouns. Arabic, we're not that direct in Arabic. It depends on who we're talking to. So this is a wonderful resource, and we'll be able to use this to compare some of the experiences that we have with the different sorts of things that our students do. Now we'll go back to the PowerPoint and look at this in a little bit more detail now. Okay, so you should be able to see my PowerPoint. Can you see that now? Yep, good, okay.
Yes.
All right, so this is the one that we've just done, and some great discussions were going on there about the way that politeness is done in your different languages. One of the things that you might have noticed is that there are different kinds of societies, and sometimes the politeness system in those societies is based on giving people lots of space. That is like giving them the opportunity to be free. So if we look at these two examples, some societies focus on giving people space and not imposing on them. So for example, if you want to invite someone to your birthday party, this one's a little bit exaggerated just for effect, but you can see. You might say something like, look, there's no obligation, but if you're not too busy, I don't suppose you'd like to come to my birthday party. Now, in English, that sounds nice because it's giving the person choice, right? You're not imposing. You're not saying you must come to my birthday party. But if you translated that into Polish or Russian or Greek, it would sound very rude. And I'm sure in many of your languages, it would sound very cold, very much like you don't care if the person really comes or not. Okay, so it's not just the language here which makes it appropriate. It's fitting in with the culture of the language of the country that that it's related to. So other cultures are more strongly focused on showing warmth and involvement and connection. And these are the cultures that tend to be more direct. The language use is more direct. Like, you absolutely must come to my birthday party. I won't take no for an answer. So which of these sounds more like your culture? You have to think about whether your culture is like giving people space or not imposing, or whether it's all about warmth and involvement, because the way that you will speak in that culture really is affected by that. Now, a lot of people already started talking about how to address people, right? What you call them. And I wanted to look at that in a little bit more detail now, about how we do it in English and how this might be different in the languages that you speak. So in English, we can address people by their given names. We can address them as Miss or Ms or Mrs. or Mr. or whatever, but we don't use the title plus the given name. Okay, so people wouldn't call you Mrs. Catherine or Dr. Jill. But my overseas students do, because they're translating directly from their own language. The family relations, we have names like mum, dad, auntie, uncle, and sometimes you might call an auntie by their name, like Auntie Irene, but you would only call somebody your auntie if they really were your auntie, right? Now, I spoke to a lot of Greek people who told me that when they were children, they used to call everybody auntie and uncle. And then when they went back to Greece as adults, they found that people often didn't appreciate that. You know, they didn't think that that was polite or appropriate. So, you know, maybe the way that we call people is part of the culture of the language. There are polite titles like sir and madam, but the culture, most cultures have these, but when you choose to use them is very different. So in Australia, we don't really use sir and madam very often, except in a shop context or a sort of a service context. But maybe in other cultures, they might be used more. And as we talked about before, there's this singular plural you, which is a really big thing in terms of politeness. If people don't have an understanding of that, they can unwittingly offend people. For professions, we use doctor and the last name, but not Mr. or Mrs. Doctor. So in German, you can say Mr. Doctor, but in English, you can't. With a professor, you would say the professor and their last name, like Professor Jones, but not Professor Fred. It doesn't sound right. So a few more of these. There are terms of endearment that people use in different cultures, like darling, honey, sweetie. There are nicknames that people use. Like in Australia, we tend to shorten names and sometimes we put an E on the end. I know in Greek, they do it with aki. In Russian, they do it with ochka. You know, there are little things that you put on the end of words. And all of these are part of pragmatics, because whether or not you choose to use them depends on the context and the formality of the context. The singular and plural you, just for a bit of background information, the languages of the world do this in a variety of ways. So if you like to have a look at this little diagram I've got on the screen, the languages in it's not here by where the languages are spoken. Languages spoken in most of Australia have no politeness distinction between the singular and the plural pronoun. Many countries have the binary distinction, like the French tu, vous, or there's the German, the Italian, they have just one distinction for a polite plural and a polite form and a singular form of you. The languages that are coloured in red here have multiple politeness distinctions. So there are many, many, many different ways that you can talk about you in order for the politeness to come through. And in blue, so for example, Japanese and some other languages of Southeast Asia, it's much more polite to avoid pronouns altogether, much more polite. So again, I'd like you to talk just for a little while, we won't be able to do this more than probably about 5 minutes, about how your language is different from English in the way you address people using names, titles, and pronouns. Now, you've thought about these already. Some of you have thought about them already in the groups that you were in, but I'd like you to think now particularly about how these are difficult for your students. So we're just going to go, I'll put this in the chat room so that hopefully everybody can see it. There's a Padlet and there's some questions. And I'd like you to talk more specifically now about these pronouns, the singular and plural pronouns, and what problems they cause for your students. Okay, I think everybody's back now. We only had time to do a very short discussion there because the other one took us rather a long time, but that's okay. All I wanted you to do really was to think about what kind of problems your students had with those. And now that we've established that these differences exist, well, what can we actually do about it? We know that from research that learners who are not taught about pragmatics, when they're not growing up in an environment where they can hear it naturally and learn it in the way that children do in their families, they learn these things very slowly or not at all. And we also know that pragmatics is often really neglected in teaching. And it isn't only community language teachers, it's all sorts of teaching all around the world. Now, these are some of the reasons. Teachers have too many other things to do. And we know that's true. There's never enough time, and there are too many other things. And maybe this isn't the case so much for community language teachers, but very often it's because teachers feel they should do the things that are in the exams, the things that students get tested on. And testing students' pragmatic knowledge is really hard to do. So other things take priority. Another problem is there's not enough training for teachers in how to teach it. Now, I don't know whether any of you have had a session on pragmatics before, but I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have not, and maybe not even heard of it. Another thing is the curriculum, that there's a focus on themes and tasks, and there's less of a focus on how to communicate in the language. Another reason that teachers don't teach pragmatics is that they believe that young children can't learn it. And yet, in the real world, when children are being socialized into a language in their family, they do learn it very young. You know, they come to understand these things by being exposed to them. And I believe that even though you can't talk about complicated things and linguistic things with young students, you can certainly expose them to it, and you can give them lots of opportunities to notice it, because it's when we notice that we learn. Another thing is that there's nothing in the textbooks. Now, I don't know what textbooks you're all using. I'm sure they're all different, and there may not be anything explicit about pragmatics in the textbooks, but pragmatic information is everywhere. Okay, you only have to see it and to notice it. So ask yourself these questions. How do your students find out about pragmatics? Do they find out by hearing the language? Do they find out by using it? Do they find out by interacting in real life contexts? And the sort of people that they may be able to talk to in real life contexts. In Australia, unfortunately, these contexts are quite limited. So they might talk to their family, especially their grandparents in the home. Some of you might have the children of second or third or fourth generation migrants who only speak English in the home. So they may not even have that. They might talk to family friends. They might talk to family in the original country, so maybe by Skype or Zoom or something. And they might even visit the original country, like the people that I talk to in my research. But the problem with this is that the language models that they're getting are not the whole story. They're partial language models. And what they develop as a result is what we call a hybrid system of pragmatics, which is strongly influenced by English. So the people in my research who went back to Greece and said please and thank you much too often were doing it because that's what we do in English. And they didn't know about the other ways to be polite in Greek that were much better. One of the problems with pragmatic competence, pragmatic knowledge, is that if you make a mistake, you very rarely get feedback on it. You know, if you use the wrong word and people won't understand you, then they will tell you you've done something wrong. But if you make a pragmatic mistake, they'll just think that you're not a nice person, or that you're rude, or that you're not very clever. And very often they don't say anything. So it's really hard to learn unless you get explicit feedback. So this is how you teach pragmatics explicitly. Whenever you teach any language, you always teach the form of the language, you teach the function, what the language does, and at the same time, you highlight the context where that language is used. So your teaching involves these things. It involves choosing appropriate forms according to the interlocutor, that means the person that you're talking to, and the purpose of what you're saying, and in context. And you need to teach your students about understanding the meanings in context. So they don't just, you know, get the words written out with nothing about who's saying them and where and so on. It always has to be in some kind of context. We have an internet full of pictures that you can use to establish a context. It's not hard. Also, an awareness of cultural values that underlie the language choices. With the older students, you can talk about these things. With the younger students, you just have to model them and show them. And the students won't always necessarily realize that this is part of their lesson. They're getting just gradually acculturated through the environment that you create, which is like a little microcosm of the country where your language is spoken. And finally, they need skill in applying pragmatic knowledge in real time. So how do you approach it? There are three ways of approaching teaching pragmatics. One is through explicit teaching, and that is where you maybe make a lesson devoted to a particular speech act, like this is how we ask, this is how we borrow things, this is how we make requests, this is how we refuse. Now, these days, that's not a particularly fashionable way of teaching. Mostly we don't do that so much anymore. We use theme-based teaching, task-based teaching, but you can still slip little bits of this in. And I think that it's possible to do that. The other way is giving the students opportunities to notice and opportunities to practice. And I just want to talk quickly about a way that you might do this. And then after that, we'll have another workshop where you'll have a chance to think about how you might integrate more pragmatics into your teaching. So imagine the speech act of apologizing when you say sorry, okay? This is a little bit of an old-fashioned type of lesson. This is like the functional approach, but let's just look at how you might do that. So what are some situations when you might say sorry? So you could elicit these from your students and list them on the board and get them to say which are the most serious. So you might be sorry because you're late. You might be sorry because you forgot your friend's birthday. You might be sorry because you broke something that belongs to your friend and that made them very sad. And then get the students to think about which of these situations involve people who are close or people that you don't know so well. And then get them to think about what they have to do when they apologize. Everyone will know how to say sorry in your language, but they may not necessarily know the other things that an apology might involve. And culturally, these are interesting because an apology can have an explanation of what happened. It can have you saying that you're sorry. It can have an excuse. Maybe you might make an offer to make amends, like, I'm really sorry that I broke your toy. I'll make you another one. Maybe you might say it might never happen again. And different cultures do these differently. So some of these might always be there. For example, the bit where you say you're sorry is pretty much always there, but the excuse is not always there. And saying it will never happen again is not always there. And then you have to think about how you can reinforce this. So it might be something like a group dialogue writing activity. Maybe the students create posters and they compare the level of language for the different contexts, like which apologies are the strongest, which responses are the most appropriate, and how would the language be different if you change something in the context. Now, the important thing about this is that if you decide to teach explicitly like this, you also need to do an ongoing follow-up. And that means that whenever you see examples in the teaching materials or in life or in your classroom, you point them out to the students. Okay, you run in, you're late for class, you forgot something you were going to give them, you say sorry, and you remind them that that is what they learned and that you're saying sorry in this context and you're saying it in this particular way. Here's another example. I know I'm going to have to go through these a little bit quickly, so forgive me, but you will have the PowerPoint to look at them later. This is an example of a game. Now, one of the aspects of pragmatics that I haven't talked about in a lot of detail here is how you organize a conversation and how, when somebody says something, how do you respond to what they say? So if I say, oh, my cat died, right? The response, sorry to hear that, is appropriate with that. And it's appropriate with bad news. So in this activity, you would give the students a list of responses in your own language and get them to say, is it for good news? Is it for bad news? Or is it for either? And you'll be able to make some responses that are appropriate to the levels of your students. Right? And that gives them the chance to notice that. So what can you do with these? Okay, then after they've got the responses, think about some utterances that might go with those responses. So things like, I lost my wallet. Oh, that's terrible. I passed my exam. Oh, that's great. I have a terrible headache. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And I'm sure all of you have used card games, but you may not have used them with pragmatic information. So basically anything you do with matching cards, you can do with pragmatic information. So things like, I used to use this with my students, a memory game where you have the cards face down and they pick up one utterance and one response. And if they go together, they keep the cards. So all of these things are sensitizing them to how what they say needs to relate to the context. Now, you can do an awful lot with role plays. I'm sure you know this already, but you may not have thought of it so much about pragmatics. So thinking about a context that's related to the theme or topic that you're teaching. Last week, for those of you who were here last week, we were talking about food and writing about food and recipes. But in the context of food, there are conversations that happen, right? Maybe asking someone to buy the ingredients or talking to someone about how delicious the food is. Or if you're like my mother-in-law, saying, you must eat more of this food. And me saying, but I'm not hungry. Oh, you must eat more, and piling my plate up really high. And this is something that might be related to your culture. You know, if a culture is about being warm and generous, then that sort of thing will be important. Okay, now we have one more task. And before we get put into groups, I'm just going to paste this task into the chat so that everybody can see it. I'm sorry, I haven't been able to see anything that you put in the chat. So I'm going to try very hard to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. Okay, I'm just going to put this into the chat now, if it's not already there. And the Padlet.
Oh, Jill is already there. I just pasted.
Oh, it is already there. Oh, great. Okay. So everybody can see it and you can go into your groups. Now, this is where you start to talk about the real stuff, okay, which is the most important stuff. And that is how you're going to integrate this into the teaching that you do. So we'll spend 15 minutes on this. And if I can steal an extra 5 minutes at the end, I'll try to tidy it up with the questions. Okay. So can everybody please go to their groups now and have a go at talking about what you can really do with your students in your class, even if they're little, and even if you can only do a little bit. Have fun. So that task was really interesting. I wish we'd had a little bit more time to do that because I know that the groups were fairly big and not everyone had a chance to talk about their language. But from what you learned from the other people, I think that you would now have maybe not necessarily a better idea about how to do it, but maybe more of an idea about why it's so important to do. And I wanted to finish with some ways that you could see Pragmatics teaching, ways that you could think of it. So Pragmatics teaching, or Pragmatics, is not just something that you teach, like today we'll have a lesson on Pragmatics. It's a lens through which you understand communication in context and which you help your students to understand communication in context. And context is woven into everything that you do. So you can also think of it like a piece of cloth that you're weaving. So if you imagine that your grammar and vocabulary and everything are these strands that everybody thinks are the most important thing, but Pragmatics goes across all of that, because every use of language is always in a context of some way. It's woven into everything that you do regarding the language. Some people sometimes think, well, we've got all these other things to do. Pragmatics is just the icing on the cake. And I want to argue that Pragmatics is not just the icing on the cake. It's more like the flour that holds the cake together. All right, so that's what I'd really like you to take away from this session, that it's all of those things. So that comes to the end of what I've got to share. And I just wanted to have a little look in the chat room because there were some really great questions there that I didn't get a chance to address because I couldn't see them. Okay, what are some of the best ways you've seen throughout your research of teaching Pragmatics? Would it be about providing scenarios and different situations? Yes, I think that is one of the best ways. So looking at how if you change a little thing in the context, the effect that that will have on the language. And at the beginning of Robin's session, some of you might have been there for Robin's session where she had the all those plates, and she said, what are some creative things that we can do with the plates? Well, what I thought is you can make masks, and you could put pictures on the plates, and you could wear these masks, and you could interact as different people. Because that's the way that you learn about how you use language differently in context. Plays are great. Role plays are great. All of these things are great, but we need somehow to have the information given to the students in a way that they can recognize, and they have to learn to be sensitive to these differences, to listen around them for what's going on. Somebody said, language changes, this is Dung Tran, language changes over space and time. English, a worldwide spoken language, affects, I'm not quite sure I understand that question, but I think if it's about the way that English affects other languages, most definitely does. You know, as I mentioned before, people have a kind of a hybrid pragmatic system, which is partly from English, which is their main language, their first language, and partly from the community language that they're trying to learn. And your job is to make their pragmatic system more native-like, so to make them more like full bilinguals, where you don't just have the words and the vocabulary and the phonology, but you have the opportunity to be who you are in the language. Okay. So somebody asked a question about regional differences. Now, this is a really difficult question where it might be polite to do something in one region of the country, but not polite to do that same thing in another region of the country. I don't really have an answer to that. I think it's just that it's part of making students aware that context has got many different facets. There's who you're with, there's what the interaction is about, and there's also where you are, you know, where you are in the country. So maybe things are done differently in the village, maybe they're done differently in the city, and they're certainly done differently in the diaspora. Again, this is what I found with my research into Greeks in Australia, that in the diaspora, the language that they speak is a little bit in between. Like it is Greek, but it's Greek very strongly impacted by Australian language. And that's the words and the phonology and the grammar, but it's also the pragmatics. So it's a very, I think, a very exciting field. And I really hope that it's something that's going to inspire you, not to be scared and think, oh my goodness, how can I do all these things? But to see everything as an opportunity for learning and for raising your students' awareness, even if they're very small. You know, even if your students are kindergarten students, they can still learn that you don't speak your language to everybody in the same way, and that you don't necessarily make the same decisions that you would make in English. So I think that's probably all that we have time for. I'd just like to thank you all for coming along and for the work you do, which I think is wonderful.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just before you go, everybody, I'd just like to also say thank you. There's a little bit of technical problems today, but look, it all went very, very well. As you can see, the feedback was great. So Jill, thank you so much. Really interesting stuff. I'd just like to could I just emphasize? Look, if Jill has known the community languages sector and she's taught the community languages certificate, I think it was a certificate back then, wasn't it, Jill?
That's right.
Well, she's done it. She did it for so long. She knows what she's talking about. So please seriously consider using these techniques and this knowledge in your teaching and spread it around to your teachers, please. It's a great thing. It's not often talked about. Could I just ask everybody just one last thing? Next week we've got translanguaging in teaching and learning. Yet another term that we don't probably use too much in the community languages school sector, but translanguaging is very evident. It's there in every class, and we'll find out a little bit more about that. You've got everybody you've got your attendance link. Please slow down this week because it got overwhelmed last week. So take your time with it. Apart from that, have a lovely evening. Jill, thank you so much again, and we'll see you all hopefully.
Thanks for the opportunity, Alex. I hope to see you again.
What about the
Bye, everyone.
Teacher.
Bye bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Alex,
Thanks,
please?
Joe.